Welcome to the final section of this course. The Node.js API consists of about 45, 46 or so modules, and so far in this course, we have used about 30 of them. In this last section, we are going to skim over some of the modules that I don't think it would be appropriate to use in this course, either because they're too experimental or because they're just outside the scope of this course. And then we are going to have a number of lectures showing examples of half a dozen or so of those remaining modules that I think it would be useful for you to use. Specifically, we're going to do lectures on HTTP2, on VM, on UDP datagram, on net, on TLS SSL, on REPL, and on async hooks. So that will be coming in the next lectures of this section. But before we jump into those modules, let's just do some final housekeeping on some of the modules that we won't be doing a deep dive on in this course. First, 3 of the modules are deprecated. So unless you're already using it, you don't want to. Deprecated APIs is a section full of modules that you really should not be using at all anymore. There's another module called domain, which is officially deprecated. Another module is called Punycode, and again, although it is part of the documentation still, it is clearly deprecated and you don't want to use it unless you absolutely have to. Next, there is a module that Node tells you you really won't have a good reason to use or will not be able to use, and that is called TTY. TTY is a stable module, but it's really part of other modules. It enforces part of the behavior that Node does automatically when you are inside of a terminal application. It does have a few things that you might find useful. For example, this event resize allows you to bind to the event when the screen size of the terminal changes. So if you're doing something like we're doing with our command line application and you want to keep track of the screen size changing so you don't have to read the screen size over and over again, you can do that. And when you do that, you're using the TTY module, but you don't actually have to require it or call TTY at all. That just exposes itself as process standard out on resize. So TTY itself is never really something that you're going to have to do require TTY. You might be doing things like binding to this resize event, but at least I have not had a situation where I needed to require the TTY module explicitly. And that is exactly what Node says will be the case for most people. In most cases, they say it will not be necessary or possible to use this module directly. If you did, though, you could access it. TTY equals required TTY. There's one module called ECMAScript modules that will be a very nice feature for Node in future versions of Node. But in this LTS, in version 8 LTS of Node, there's some crucial components missing. So in version 8, it's still considered experimental. You have to turn it on with an experimental flag, and there are some crucial components like import that are missing. For me, the primary reason to use ESM modules was so that you could switch from the require syntax to the import syntax and end up importing modules back and forth that way. With Node 8, that's not a possibility because import is not part of this release. In future versions, it will be, and then switching over to ESM modules, ECMAScript modules, is something that I would recommend. There are 2 modules that require third-party tools to use. One is called tracing, which really just allows you to create log files that allow you to do tracing in Chrome or some other tracing reader. For us, tracing isn't a major concern, but if you do need to do tracing and you have some way to read traced files like in Chrome, then you can look into this module. The other one is the inspector. The inspector is experimental, but this inspector module basically just provides an API so that you can interact with the V8 inspector. You'll still need some way to do that. This is just exposing different ways that you could be interacting. If you're building some kind of inspector or you're using an inspector, then you can plug into this module here. Now there's 3 other modules that might be useful to you, but they require you to build Node separately. These aren't things that you can just do in Node out of the box. You need to rebuild your own version of Node, a recompiled Node that is, with these things turned on and with whatever additions that you've added. These 3 things are going to be internationalization. So if you have situations where you need to support internationalization, you can rebuild Node with this built in. Or if you have your own ICU, as they call it, you can embed that internationalization data inside of Node and provide it at runtime if you like. There are different options for you to do, and by default, none of these or very few of these are going to be turned on. The other 2 modules I mentioned are C++ add-ons and C++ add-ons and API. Both of these modules allow you to write C++ and then rebuild Node or include that C++ within Node and reference it from JavaScript land. Obviously, writing C++ would be outside the scope of this course, but if you are interested in writing a C++ add-on, those are built in here. The major difference between these modules is that an API is striving to support a consistent way to interact with the module so that the C++ APIs don't keep changing over time, whereas C++ add-ons isn't striving for any kind of intergenerational consistency there. If you'd like to do C++ add-ons, you'd like to write C++ and interact with V8 directly, the Node documentation walks you through some hello world stuff where you can write C++ and build it into Node yourself. You will need some tools like Node.js, etc., but it is a pretty straightforward documentation if you want to go into there. All right, without further ado, we can now start jumping in to some examples of the last few remaining modules that we mentioned: HTTP2, VM, REPL, etc., etc. So let's move on to the next lecture and explore these final modules.